In July of 2005, Ugandans overwhelmingly voted in a constitutional referendum, bringing to an end a 19-year ban on multi-party politics. This was described as a masterstroke of democratic genius. But let's be honest, has it delivered on good governance? We find out tonight on this edition of Turning Round Uganda, your alternative policy documentary series. I'm Simon Kasiate.
This is Turning Round Uganda, the alternative policy series. Coming up on the program.
If someone has given you notice and has said, we're going to pass through this and we don't have a history of violence, it becomes very difficult to see why you have to spray people you don't agree with some sort of pink liquid that no one understands the chemical composition of.
Return term limits like yesterday.
The real question is not what we need. The real question is how do we get it?
I believe personally, citizens' action is what is required now.
And the people speak through, when they don't speak through parliament, they have an option of speaking directly through referenda.
The person who holds the key to Uganda's future right now, unfortunately, is the president.
Uganda is independent.
After getting independence, a number of African leaders came to a realization that the multi-party system, which the colonial powers had left behind, was a known traditional African democracy.
I like the idea of our democracy. I think that is very good. Let's not flatten the world. In other words, the world is not the same. Democracy in America is not necessarily democracy in the United Kingdom, and it's not necessarily democracy in Kenya. So the first question is, what does our democracy look like?
In pre-colonial Ankole, for example, it is the advisors of the king and his wives who decided that the king was no longer potent, and they gave him poison, and that was the end of it. Is that how we want to change leaders? I'm not sure that that's the best way. In pre-colonial Buganda, for example, the Kabaka wasn't simply the king, as you use the word in English. The Kabaka was several individuals. Power was never personified in one single individual. There were different systems of checks and balances in a way. So one needs to, and I think for the population at large, something which has the taste, the flavor, the credibility of something which connects with the history of the country is likely to have greater support than something which is justified on the basis that this is how they do it in England.
So they quickly opted for a one-party governance, which was constantly overthrown in military coups. Uganda, one of the most vibrant and promising economies in sub-Saharan Africa with potential for growth, was curtailed by more than 20 years of civil strife. The once promising country descending into utter political, economic and social chaos. After suffering under bloody military regimes for some time, Ugandans began agitating for free and fair elections. In December 1980, Obote returned to power through what was generally regarded as rigged multi-party elections. Some politicians in the Democratic Party and Uganda Patriotic Movement refused to accept the official election results and left former politics to engage in guerrilla activities against the Obote II government. Following a prolonged guerrilla war in the Luwero Triangle, in which over 500,000 Ugandans perished, General Tito Okello Lutwa and Brigadier Basilio Okello toppled the government of Obote II on the 25th of July 1985. They set up a government which was in turn overthrown on the 26th of January 1986 by the National Resistance Movement led by now President Yoweri Museveni. Museveni decreed a government of national unity with himself as president. This was a turning point in Uganda's history. Uganda became a model for Africa and an emerging democracy.
This is a country that is emerging out of a dictatorship. And I think over the last 20 years or so, we have invested fairly in trying to build the institutions and the structures and the legal regime that are the foundation for democracy.
We have, first of all, to appreciate the tenets of democratic governance and then design a system that will achieve that. And the tenets of democratic governance are, first of all, free and fair elections. And the free and fair elections will deliver a president or prime minister based on their manifesto appeal to the public. And when they deliver such a president or prime minister or whatever name they call them, that person is entitled or mandated to implement their manifesto, and so he or she is required to pick his team, the cabinet.
You must first and foremost accept and practice and observe and respect the doctrine of the separation of powers, in which case you should understand that there are three arms of governance. We have got the executive, we have got judiciary, we have got legislature. These are independent of each other but work in harmony. And the moment you do not appreciate that level of independence and you think that one arm is stronger than the other, certainly you lose the track. That is the fundamental point that every other person must agree to and respect. Number two, then when you now go into the tenets of what you will consider to be good governance, derived from the doctrine of separation of powers, then you must know that in order to measure up to that, then you need to observe the rule of law. Rule of law, and when we're talking about the rule of law, we are talking about the functions, the respect given to the judiciary arm, the judicial arm of government to interpret the laws that Parliament, the executive, makes, and that all our actions must be within the confines of the law. Nobody should be seen to be above the law, regardless of what position you hold.
The reason I call this a quasi-democracy is that the operationalization of those of that foundation is not fully in place, and in fact, in most of the cases, what you see are some major reversals on what we have been able to accomplish. So you see a country that is really struggling to be a democracy, but it is not, and therefore you can just describe it as a quasi-democracy.
We cannot talk about democracy until we have dealt with the question of who actually owns Uganda. Development that comes with democracy is not going to be possible, not at least for the moment, until we have sorted out the question of leadership and the question of ownership of this country.
In Uganda's new era of democracy, general elections, though not multi-party, were held every 5 years, and in 1996, President Museveni took a landslide victory of 74.2% of the votes. His close contender, Paul Kawanga Ssemwogerere, garnered 23.7%, followed by Kibirige Mayanja at 123,290, accounting for 2.1% of the vote. These elections were generally regarded as free and fair.
President Museveni, as the president, occupying the highest office in the country, has certainly made a contribution, a significant contribution, to progress in this country.
If you consider President Museveni in the first 10 years of his presidency, you would characterize him as a transformative leader. That as a leader, he seeks to build consensus. He seeks to provide leadership on major challenging issues. I was actively involved in his campaigns in 1996. So I happened to be at the center of the campaigns to demobilize Semogerere's inter-party alliance at Makerere. And from that point, I basically, for me, it was clear that yes, Uganda had moved, had made significant gains in terms of democracy as of 1996. It had made some significant gains in terms of the economy, in terms of social indicators. Most of these indicators were moving in the positive direction.
From 1986 up to the time President Museveni led the constitution making and the promulgation of which, one would have rightly assumed that he is a man of constitutional values and respects the rule of law. Now you seem to say he is otherwise. At what point did he begin to deviate from this constitutional statesman?
There was a point when you gave the president the benefit of the doubt. I think there was that point when Ugandans generally had, going, and the preamble of the Constitution talks about this, recalling our history that has been marked by extra-constitutional changes of government, violence, etc. I think a number of Ugandans said, well, let's give this president a chance. But I think in hindsight, and his own more current statements that says, if I had lost in 1996, I'd have gone to the bush. If you read Sowing the Mustard Seed and you understand, I think there's a growing realization that we were fooled.
We have a brand of democracy that was designed by President Museveni and endorsed by the CA, and since then, all of us have continued to promote it.
However, since the 1995 Constitution was adopted, Uganda has quickly slid backwards in terms of respect for civil and political liberties.
How many times have you seen civilians unarmed within their rights exercising and registering their displeasure with the system, with the service, and go in the streets to demonstrate? And they have very vehemently suppressed with the maximum force, as if Uganda had been invaded by a foreign force.
It's true, the police can say, well, they're the rights of the traders, you have the rights of other peace-loving Ugandans, etc. But surely, if someone has given you notice and has said, we're going to pass through this and we don't have a history of violence, it becomes very difficult to see why you have to spray people you don't agree with some sort of pink liquid that no one understands the chemical composition of and the long-term effects of, so that balancing act can and should be reached. I don't think it has been reached properly. The case, for instance, when an opposition leader was bundled into a pickup, and this is someone who has got about 30+% of the votes cast. Now, surely you don't treat anyone like that, but you don't really treat a leader of the opposition in the real sense, de facto, like that. You don't spray him, you don't pepper spray him to that extent. I was watching that particular clip with my son, Prime News, and I remember it was brutal. And it reminded me of Idi Amin. It was brutal in the sense that from that day, from that moment, my son has always feared the police. Even if it's just a sort of a traffic something and they're coming, he will shrink and shiver. And I think the number of other brutalized young Ugandans in that state.
The Constitution has been amended so many times to render it an illusionary law, as some political scholars now call it.
If a constitution is so devoid of constitutionalism, if a country is so lacking in constitutional practice, then what you have is not a constitution properly so-called. You have a ghost of a constitution. And that can even be more dangerous than no constitution, in my own thinking. The element of respect in all levels of population, I feel, is lacking, right from the head of state, and I think that's why it's most problematic.
It has serious internal contradictions that cannot deliver democratic governance, because you cannot talk about separation of powers between the three arms of government, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, when the president, who is the head of the executive, appoints the chief justice, the deputy chief justice, the principal judge, all the judges of the High Court, justices of the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal, and Constitutional Court. How can you talk about independence of the judiciary? And the president appoints directly 20% of parliament. The 10 soldiers plus the 70 ministers, that is 80 people who sit in parliament, a parliament of 375, that's over 20% of the legislature directly appointed by the president. So the environment we have created within our constitution cannot provide for the principle of separation of powers, which would lead us to democratic governance.
The 1995 one was a very good time to have a national constitution. The problem was, since then, one group has really toned it down, has made it lose the sanctity it's supposed to have. One way, as you say, would be to amend it again. But really, the problem with that would be that it has been amended so many times that really, it seems that there's nothing left to amend.
When Turning Round Uganda returns,
how does the army dominate all politics? You really have a problem there.
Uganda has never seen any of its presidents handing over power peacefully to his successor, causing many Ugandans to believe that no government can change without the active intervention of the army.
Since the NRM government has been in power with the same individual heading that administration for 20 whatever years, and with it stating openly and publicly that the key institution of the state is the army. Therefore, you have a certain degree of subordination of all other institutions to the army.
This threat of the army is not good for this country, because they are telling us again, the bush, the bush. When will this bush mentality end?
The army is a technical arm of government. It is very much like the tax office. Tax office is also a technical arm of government. It's very much like Department of Health. These are technical bodies which specialize in their own areas. So the army is that kind of technical arm. Its job is to defend the territorial integrity of the country. The question is, how does the army dominate all politics? You really have a problem there of reducing the entire political body politic to the armed forces alone. I would suggest that the cause of that is the failure of us to address the question of ownership. Because if there were real owners, they would put their agenda on the table. Actually, the usurpers have no respect for us at all. Okay? So the only way they stay in power is by using the army, which becomes an abnormality in politics.
Uganda's democracy started to suffer as elections were marred with massive rigging and irregularities.
President Museveni in 1981 went to the bush ostensibly for elections having been rigged. And let me tell you, that time, 1980 was the time when I first voted. I was a student leader in the university. I voted. And that time I went for campaigns throughout the country. As the mobilizer then and the organizing secretary for DP in Makerere University. Nowhere did we see the type of violence we have registered today. So, if really President Museveni went to the bush because of electoral malpractices in 1980, I expected him and his government to have done better.
It's even more pernicious, the idea that you have a population that realizes the enslavement, but at the same time are given particular rituals by which then they participate in a sort of mockery of democracy. And I'll give you one specific example. You had the president of this country saying that had he lost the elections in 1996, he would have gone to the bush. I think that's why you're having an increasing number of Ugandans staying at home. I myself do not vote, precisely because I don't see any real change that will come through voting, respect for voting. If I'm aware that in a particular hill, 1,000 of soldiers are being given 5, 6, 7 ballot papers to fill in, then the numerical significance of my vote diminishes.
You know very well that even in some areas, the number of votes received was higher than the registered voters. So how do you take that? You think that is the will of the people?
The relationship between a well-governed country and a country that holds elections is sometimes as different as night and day. It is true that the fear of exiting office through the ballot may cause politicians to pursue particular types of policies that are pro-people. But this is in really mature democracies. In emerging democracies, what you have are predatory elites that simply rig the vote and ensure that they are in control of the instruments of power so that they can pursue policies that sometimes are not recognizable with what they say in their manifestos.
Electoral violence and intimidation have become commonplace as the space for freedoms of expression, speech and association rapidly shrink. Presidential term limits were removed to give President Museveni unlimited terms in power in 2005.
When the debate began about extending the term limits and make it open-ended, all he said for a long time was, I will respect the Constitution. Very interesting statement, because he doesn't say, as Anyere said, enough is enough. He says, I will respect the Constitution. But I think, in hindsight again, in full knowledge that before that time comes, the Constitution will have been changed to suit his current. And so when the time comes, the Constitution has been changed. So in that case, cynically, and that's, for me, that's the problem. Cynically, with a lot of cynicism, respect the Constitution then translates into more terms.
I was in this parliament in 2005. Yes, you were. When we went through the constitutional amendment exercise. And you know that the constitutional amendment exercise started with the Constitutional Review Commission, which was headed by Professor Sembebwa. And they were given very clear terms of reference. And I'm afraid, amendment of Article 105, which stipulates the term limits, was not one of those put in the terms of reference for the operation of the Sembebwa Commission. But for shellfish ends, we found ourselves in the parliament here and procedurally coming to amend Article 105 too. And this is one of those articles in our Constitution which is entrenched, meaning that you cannot just, as a parliament, stand up and amend it without a recourse to the populace. The only way, if we were to have this article or any article which is entrenched to be amended, it had to go for referendum. Just like we went for the political system in the Constitution, whether to continue with the monolithic movement system or to go multi-party. You remember, we had to go for a referendum. And this Article 1052 is one of those which should have gone for referendum. But because we felt that we were alpha and omega, we decided selfishly to ignore the constitutional provision. I remember very vividly the letter, the legal opinion given by the late Wapakabulo. Let him rest in peace. He gave a concrete legal opinion. The late Attorney General, Francis Ayume, let him rest in peace, gave a comprehensive legal opinion advising strongly that if we were to amend Article 1052, we should follow the law and go for a referendum. The powers that be ignored. The advice, the legal advice given by the framers of this constitution, because these two people were very senior. One was Attorney General. Actually, the other one had been a speaker at the time when this constitutional amendment exercise was going on. So, selfishly, we decided to tamper with the Constitution. We decided to cheapen the Parliament, and 5 million shillings was dished out to members of Parliament. And in order for you to be a beneficiary of that 5 million shillings, one, you had to be a movement supporter. You had to be a person who was in support of the legality. And then there, these 5 million blindfolded people. And because they had the majority, they took the day. And now you see what we are in. Now, the same group of people are clamoring with, hey, can we amend the Constitution? Can we amend the Constitution? But the powers that be have entrenched themselves. They don't want it. But in my own personal opinion, I strongly feel that for stable political administration, for stable handover of power, for political stability, so that we do not go back to bloodshed that we people as a country suffered. We should go back to presidential term limits. We should go back to the 5-year presidential term limits for 2 terms.
Well, as you know, I am one of those who fought for retention of term limits. And therefore, I cannot be very fair on this question because my interests are clear. It's not that term limits by themselves would solve all our problems. But you realize that in Africa, there is hardly a sitting president who has been voted out in a fair election. And this is possibly because of this concept of the power of incumbency, that the longer the president stays, the more he's able, the more he or she is able, has the capacity to manipulate any electoral process. Not necessarily through rigging, but through influence, some of which could be corruption, paying this and that, influencing the electoral commissioners and so on. So I think if we are able to restore term limits, some of the unfairness out of presidential elections will be taken out considerably. There's of course the fact that the longer someone stays in office, the more he or she wants to continue.
5 years the American, 8 years is the French, but the world is bigger than just America and France. There's the Chinese system, for example. Under the Chinese system, not just the president, but the entire leadership changes every 10 years. Okay, the whole lot goes out, and a new lot comes in. So you have to keep that in mind. I mean, all of these people have reached their particular systems as a result of their own experience. The Americans reason that two terms is enough, and if you put them in power for 8 straight years, it's not just that you're giving time for them to do what they're supposed to do, which is what the French say, that 8 years is what you need to give them time to do what they're supposed to do. The Americans say that it may be, if somebody is doing harm, it may be too long. They have 8 years to do damage. So that at least you should have a check on them after the end of 5 years.
So that however big, however mighty you are, however bad you are, however good you are, even if you claim to have the security organs under your armpit, when your 2 terms have come to an end, Ugandans will have a sigh of relief to say, at least we can now breathe.
In July of 2005, Ugandans overwhelmingly voted in a constitutional referendum, bringing to an end a 19-year-old ban on multi-party politics.
One of President Museveni's fundamental major contribution that he's made in this country, which is rarely recognized, is the fact that he helped create the space in which institutions emerged. But all these institutions are now suffering under his personality. So if there's anything that you need to do to be able to build, to further build our democracy, those institutions need to be liberated from the domineering personality of a larger figure who is President Museveni.
80% of the Constitution is heaping responsibility on the president. There shall be a human rights commission, the president shall appoint. There shall be Uganda Direct Corporation, the president shall appoint. There shall be Uganda Revenue Authority, the president shall appoint. There shall be this, the president. 80% of the constitution is practically heaping authority on the president. So that makes the president almost invincible.
Institutions of state are gone. They have been broken down. You have regime institutions which are fighting to protect the regime, not the state. Just like the police, which we have been talking about. The police does not invest resources to protect people on the roads. You have carnage on the roads, hundreds of thousands of people dying on the roads. You have people being slaughtered in their homes, whole families being slaughtered in their homes. You have the iron bar people hitting people left and right. You have all kinds of crime all over the place. But if you see the kind of investment around containing Besigye, I've told you today, in fact, in my village, it's now like a barracks.
Political parties have made efforts to set up party structures, and the space for civil society organizations to operate legally has widened. Legal and institutional changes have been made to provide for a functioning democracy, but politics in Uganda is yet to conform to the principles of multipartyism.
We are not adhering to the principles, the doctrine of separation. Not long ago, just towards the end of last year, you saw a standoff between the executive and the legislature, where the chief executive of this country referred to members of parliament as idiots and fools. I mean, surely, where in the world, in the aura of separation of the doctrine of separation of powers, will you find such a thing happen? Not long ago, I believe you were here in Kampala, that very black day when the black mambas invaded the Temple of Justice, ran over the High Court in Kampala. Where on earth will you find such a thing if it is not only in Uganda? We have got cases where people are seen to be above the law, as it were. They take the law into their hands and they exercise a lot of impunity. You remember during the 2006 elections, what happened in Mengo? When one UPDF officer took the law into his hands and mowed down supporters of FDC right at the gates of Bulange. Where in the world will you find such if it is not only in Uganda? How many times have you seen the military using the guns bought for them for the protection and security of this country by the taxpayers of this country, turning the guns against them?
In many respects, the institutions of law and justice are breaking down, and people are losing confidence in these institutions, like the police, when they cut down on demonstrations in such a ferocious manner. They don't allow meetings and gatherings. These are signs of illegitimacy, that we are actually sliding down to a point when someone will say that this government has lost legitimacy.
After over 2 decades of relative stability, Ghana is seen as a beacon of peace and good governance in a region that has seen more than its fair share of governmental dysfunction, institutionalized corruption, and endemic political violence. Since 1992, Ghana has been changing her governments without any destabilization, an achievement which has made her a hub of democracy in the sub-Saharan part of Africa. The 2012 general elections were the 6th since 1992. With a voter turnout of almost 80%, most Ghanaians have embraced the electoral system as a means of delivering shared national goals and maintaining an overall political stability. Ghana's shining status in democratic governance won the attention of the first African-American president of the United States of America, Barack Obama.
The people of Ghana have worked hard to put democracy on a firmer footing, with repeated peaceful transfers of power even in the wake of closely contested elections.
In July 2012, the West African nation suffered a blow at the untimely death of its president, John Atta Mills. John Dramani Mahama, formerly Ghana's vice president, was sworn in as the country's new president within hours. Until that term had ended in December, when the country went to the polls and retained Mahama as president of the republic, there wasn't any form of instability. As a result of this political stability, the country is among the fastest growing economies in the world and is expected to make moves towards increased industrialization. Even neighboring Kenya is taking positive strides in this direction. It isn't far-fetched for one to say it is a place to look to for some inspiration.
You need an independent electoral commission. How can you have an electoral commission which is appointed by the person who has the most to lose in an election? The real question is not what we need. The real question is, how do we get it? How do we get an independent constitution? How did the Kenyans get an independent constitutional commission? Okay, what did they do? They actually organized over years for a new constitution. And they made themselves a constitution through sort of bottom-up processes, so that constitution making was actually an exercise which was resisted by the people in power, but still it was done by those outside of power. And eventually people in power found that, well, the easiest option was to accept what had come up from the bottom.
In Kenya right now, and I wish that could be the situation here in Uganda, where in order to serve as electoral commissioner and to be in that commission, all the political parties that are running for an electoral office sit together, they propose names. They are the ones to propose names. They propose names before forwarding them to Parliament for vetting. And not only that, the entire country should be involved in identifying and vetting so that we are able to get the right person for the right office. But as of now, the President Electoral Commission is constituted by the government of the day, and they know that they certainly have to respect the side of the bread which is better buttered, and in which case they have no voice.
Kenya are on the right track. Kenya held a referendum in 2010 and trimmed the powers of the president. The president of Kenya does not appoint the Chief Justice, the Deputy Chief Justice, and the judges. The president does not. The president does not appoint the Inspector General of Police, and the president does not appoint the Electoral Commission. Those are key institutions in the principle of democratic governance and accountability. So when the president does not appoint those, and they are appointed through an open, competitive process. I watched them on TV. It was fantastic. The job of the Chief Justice, Inspector General of Police, and Deputy Chief Justice were advertised in the papers. People applied for the jobs. They were put through a very competitive and grueling interview process, where the public sat in the gallery, and the public were allowed to offer views before the sitting on these people. And by the time they got a Chief Justice and the Chairman of the Electoral Commission and the Inspector General of Police, these people do not owe their holding offices to anybody. They owe it to their merit and to a good constitution. And that's the kind of thing that we need.
That constitution has been changed over and over. And some of the things we hope that the power is within the people is no longer within the people. Some things have been changed. The president has taken all the powers from different places through manipulating the constitution, changing the term limits, allocating him powers that he should not have. I don't believe the president should be the one appointing the judges. I don't believe the president should be the one appointing the IGG. I think the president, such authority should be put in a group of interactions, like a group of a council maybe.
I think for me it will mostly be an appeal to the Ugandan people. We have to take a stand at some point. We cannot continue with the way things are and hope that maybe a miracle will fall from the sky and things will change. We have to stand as Ugandans, and we have to stand together because no one is standing for us. So as Ugandans, let's get up and do something. Let's get up and do something about this system.
What is the alternative policy?
The president of Uganda in particular has an immediate task, which is to organize a peaceful transfer of power from the armed men that he came with from the bush to a different kind of people, a different set of people that have been nominated or elected or appointed by Ugandans. So my recommendation are based on the assumption of a transition already, that there's got to be a transition.
Anybody who cares for this country must focus on how to manage the transition from the Museveni era to a new dispensation. And it's a crossroad. Two things can happen. Mismanagement of this transition can lead to a failed state.
Let's dialogue. And besides, there are actually no more bushes left. But actually, now the bush is right on the street, right in our churches. Let's all of us rise up and say, enough is enough. Let's also sit at the table. Let President Museveni not be afraid of conversations, of dialogue.
The option of parliament clearly seems to be not an option anymore. And the president is threatening parliament. If parliament misbehave, then I will go back to the army. So the only option that we have left is the people. Let's hear him say if the people misbehave. And the people speak through, when they don't speak through parliament, they have an option of speaking directly through referenda.
Sure, the power lies with the people, but you know, the people by themselves don't just move. When people move by themselves, the impact is more destructive than constructive because they move by just through a vote of no confidence, through targeting that which they don't like. But that movement we've had in this society many times. What we need is something more than that, something which will seek to build something constructive. And that constructive possibility only arises if people around power realize that it's too short-sighted to just stick around power and seek to build connections with those who are already disenchanted with power.
One of the fears, of course, of a sitting president is that you're in a sense riding a tiger, that you're doomed if you do and doomed if you don't. If you continue riding it, you face an end at some point. If you get off it, you face an immediate end. But I think the examples of Ghana, of Tanzania in particular, and closer Kenya, show that the population can be extremely forgiving if they're aware that you have saved them from worse, turmoil by stepping down. And I think the fear that is held by a number of presidents is unfounded. I think the fear, and I think it's a very important question because people don't seem to think that a very powerful person can be afraid. But I think that's a very important factor, and I think it forced the opposition to, and Ugandans at large, to guide and to reassure the president that, look, there's life after the presidency of comfort, but also of security and peace.
We are also looking at, of course, most obviously, a citizenry which is re-energized and which is very ready to take on the 2016 election, that looks at the 2016 election as an election whereby they're going to reinforce their decision. And all this is collaborative. It involves different stakeholders. It involves the government on one hand. It involves political parties. It involves the electoral management body. It involves the civil society. And I think as a parting shot, to make a good 2016 election, all these stakeholders have to come together with that plan and achieve consensus that indeed the electoral reform proposals that we are talking about are very paramount in terms of making Uganda leap from stage A to stage B in terms of its democratic process.
So there are alternative routes. Of course, you can talk about a coup and so many other, and they're feasible, or death, etc. But those are alternative routes. But I think the easiest, the one that will be more sustainable, the one that will be almost practical and straightforward, doesn't lie with the opposition, but lies with the president himself, fortunately or unfortunately. And that is where it falls to him to give us a Nyerere-like solution. I think that would be the simplest way to stability forever. A Nyerere-like solution, a Moi-like solution, because Moi has so many similarities with the president, but in the end of it all, he did the best thing that he could ever have done for Kenya, to step aside.
After all has been said and done, it remains indeed true that democracy, good governance, and modernity cannot be imported or imposed onto a country. It all boils down to homegrown solutions to domestic challenges. Thank you for watching, and you, the experts, for chipping in. You can always keep the comments coming through our Facebook and Twitter handles. The name is Turning Round Uganda. Goodbye for now.